Greetings, programs. Welcome to episode 20, Dispatches from the Abortion Front, round 3. So today, as you might have guessed from the title, we are revisiting abortion. We will look over the best argument I have heard to date for anti-choice and try to steelman them if possible. We will also take a brief look at what makes a fetus different from adult human and why this is going to become a white-hot topic in the next few decades. Hint, it's transhumanism. Why does it matter? Well, if we can't even sort out whether a woman has the right to decide what happens inside her own body, or not, how well are we going to handle people with working artificial legs, or a mind uploaded into a server, or someone who fixes their dementia by having the dodgy bits of their brain replaced with hardware? Anywho, that's for another vid. So on with today's vid. So a person called Nathaniel Lazima engaged with me on a thread and brought up some points that really made me think about where my ethical boundaries lay and why I have the views that I have, and where the edges for those views are. One of the major issues was responsibility. For example, if you press a button that activates a machine that executes a person, are you held responsible? Almost all of us would say yes. Now, if you have the same machine visibly hooked up to a timer and a button that stops the machine, and you are aware of this, are you responsible if you do not press the button? I would say yes. Some rules and laws say no. If I understand correctly in the US, if you walk away from a disaster that you can easily prevent, say by pushing a button, then you are not held to be responsible for it, or for the lives that might be lost. In much of Europe, however, you are held responsible. Some minimal duty of care is required. You are not held responsible, however, if you do not jump into a river to rescue someone at risk. But if you knowingly fail to throw a lever or push a button that could save somebody, you are held responsible. Well, which is the right way? Well, it depends on your point of view. If there was an obvious right way, there wouldn't be two different sets of laws at either side of the planet, both from countries that consider themselves to be actually quite moral, thank you. See footnote number 1, the trolley problem, which highlights this in a nice format and makes you think about things that make you responsible for things and ethics and stuff. Most of us will have already have heard of it, but if you haven't, go look it up. It will show up in pretty much any discussion at some point. Now, why does this matter? Well, because the argument I got involved in was based on responsibility. And here I shall spell out their argument as best I understood it at the time. This is their argument. We hold people responsible for their actions. The pilot of a passenger plane cannot abdicate their responsibility for the lives under their care. They cannot, in mid-flight, say, "Yeah, I've had enough of this being a pilot lark," and then simply get up from the controls and go sit in the passenger seat. Well, the same holds true for a pregnant woman. She is similarly responsible for the life growing inside her, just like the pilot is responsible for the people in their plane. And so similarly, the woman must be held responsible, just like if she is irresponsible and drinks while pregnant, or does drugs, or simply wants to end the life growing inside her. Now, that made me think, because I really had to think about what was wrong here. And that's good, because it really made me think why I had the stance that I had. Now, as regards my position, which is not the truth, but simply where I hang my hat and can defend my position, or at least have been able to so far, I look at it this way. Whether you press the button or not, what matters is, what was the outcome? And did you know? We cannot hold a person responsible if they simply randomly pressed an unmarked button out of curiosity, and in some other place something happens and somebody dies. Their knowledge limits their responsibility. It also speaks to their intent. If they pressed a button fully knowing that it would kill, that tells us they are a far different person from someone who pushed a random button that accidentally led to a lethal accident. This is why manslaughter is a different judgment from murder. And if you do not know that pressing the button will stop a killing, you likewise cannot be held responsible for failing to press the button. After all, you have no idea what could happen. But you can if you are an engineer, and you know what this machine does and what the countdown does. And if you hate the person in the machine and simply walk away from the whole situation, you will be held responsible. Okay, well, how does any of that map to pilots and abortions? Good question, imaginary interviewer. Thanks for asking. Well, given that a woman can withdraw consent for a fetus to be inside her body, and therefore withdraw consent to continue the pregnancy, a pilot could withdraw their consent to pilot the plane. Well, whether the pilot crashes the plane into a mountain, or whether the pilot lets go of the controls and the plane just happens to slam into a nearby mountain, the same level of responsibility accrues. You did X, plane slams into mountain, your fault. So surely, if they just get up away from the controls and go sit in the passenger seat, they are just as responsible as if they madly flew directly into a mountain. Well, from my perspective, sure, same issue. But when comparing pilots to women, there are some similarities and some differences, and therefore some issues with the analogy. So let's look at the pilot thing a little more. In a commercial flight, there are multiple pilots. Usually there's 2 or even 3. A pilot and a co-pilot, and on some planes, a navigator. And in a pinch, the navigator can fly the plane. If there's an issue where the pilot thinks that they should not be flying the plane, and I have suddenly taken it into my head to suddenly and with no warning quit flying the plane, that would definitely count as a good reason not to be flying. The responsible thing for the pilot to then do would be to turn over the controls to the co-pilot and go lie down. In that circumstance, staying at the controls would be irresponsible, and quitting would actually be the responsible move. Well, that's not a great analogy. So let's say it's a single engine plane with 1 pilot and say 3 passengers. There's no one else that can take the stick. That's a lot closer, right? The pilot cannot withdraw their consent without somebody getting dead, right? Sure. But the analogy still breaks down in other important ways. You can indeed say that the pilot took on the responsibility to fly by showing up to work that day, just like the woman took on responsibility for bearing a child by having sex. But that doesn't stack up right. There are critical differences, ignoring the concept of continuous consent. A pilot is trained. A pilot is under contract with certain stipulated responsibilities they not only agree to, but signed up for. And they get paid. It's a job. It's a career. That's quite different. None of this holds for a woman that is pregnant, no matter whether the pregnancy was deliberate, or an accident, or even rape. She signed no contract. She does not get paid. She did not undergo training. And the pilot is not having their bodily autonomy impacted. The pilot has no permanent physical changes or risk of death as a result of flying. And the people the pilot is flying with do have bodily autonomy and can suffer if they are hurt or killed in an accident, none of which holds for the fetus. So, to bring it back to pregnancy and abortion, while we might prefer that a person take responsibility for their actions, we cannot know their circumstances. As I was just reminded, yes, even in 2019, there are people who still think it's not possible to get pregnant if you have sex standing up, or the first time you have sex. Just ask any nurse or doctor that deals with teen pregnancy. They'll be able to tell you a long list of stupid stories just like that. Yeah, this is not just stuff from like the 1920s, it's still happening today. And there's a correlation that should be bizarre, in that this sort of thing is strongly correlated with places that are anti-choice. It's like they want more ignorant people who are easily manipulated. But even if somebody was careless, or even flat out stupid, it does not change the situation. Somebody's pregnant. That needs to be addressed. And the ambulance people don't refuse to rescue you from a gully just because you were driving too fast and therefore it's your own fault. Keep in mind, this is a secondary argument for me. I tire of being sucked down the rabbit hole of, it's a human. Because that's bullshit. Even biologists have no hard definition for what makes a human into a human. As demonstrated by the fact that no evolutionary biologist can pinpoint a line when a proto-human ape became a human ape. We know how the mechanisms of the brain work, but we still don't know what mechanism allows for consciousness. We know what it is, when your mirroring ability leads your mind to mirror itself and therefore become aware of itself. But what is that? We don't know. Science doesn't know. So the rest of us sure as hell don't know either. And this leads me on to a few of the secondary questions that my interlocutor asked me. They asked me by what standard I judged a human being to be a human being as opposed to, say, some lump of human flesh? Well, there is no such standard. And I'm something of a transhumanist, so in other locations I do argue this sort of thing. There is no standard. And I can make it a little bit obvious. If I upload myself into a computer, my consciousness that is, and I feel like myself, and then by every measure and test, the same mind, am I a human being? I have a human mind, human thoughts, human memories. Should I therefore have the rights of a human being? Concept of personhood is something that comes up in debates like this, and while it may be fuzzy, it is attempting to get at the part of the human that matters, the thing that makes you still a person. Even if you lose a leg, you're still a person. Or even if you somehow, sci-fi accident, manage to lose your whole body, you are the mind. And that's the part that the fetus in the question lacks utterly, as does a person in a permanent vegetative state. It's part of what makes you a human being, and not just a sack of flesh with a heartbeat. Now, the point that started this whole thing off was the concept of responsibility, which can be summarized as you had sex, sex has consequences, you are therefore responsible for having to deal with those consequences as a result of having the sex. Or otherwise noted, it's your own fault. Well, responsibility is irrelevant. Well, that sounds a bit dramatic. But yes, utterly and completely irrelevant to the situation. The woman is pregnant. That's the situation. How she got that way has no impact on the rights that she has or the rights that the fetus has, as demonstrated by the fact we do not give less rights to people who are born and raised as a result of accidental pregnancy, which statistically is 40% of all pregnancies. See footnote number 2, accidental pregnancies. And I think I might have mentioned this in the past, but I'll mention it again. This is also the foundational ethic for dealing with organ transplants. Organs are not given preferentially to people based on how responsible they were for needing them. The only criteria, or the major criteria, is for how good a custodian they would be for the replacement organ. For example, if there was a lung available and 2 people needing it, and one was a smoker, then the lung would likely go to the non-smoker, because the lung would likely not last in the smoker and thus would have less value, or, to put it another way, would be wasted. However, if the smoker was a person who quit smoking 5 years ago, and generally led a healthy, responsible lifestyle, but the cancer was left over from that time, then they have as much right to the lung as a non-smoker, and other considerations would need to be examined, such as how long each person could survive while waiting for another lung to make an appearance, that kind of thing. Those are the criteria that these situations are judged by. And while we may feel that the non-smoker should have more of a claim, that's not how ethics and rights work. They have to be cold and calculating, which is why this sort of thing is so damn hard. And however we may not like it, that the careless bitch who gets an abortion so that she doesn't have to miss a red carpet night in 3 weeks, she still has as much right to an abortion as a 13-year-old rape victim, even if we might feel that the second person has more of a claim. Now, another thing that came up in the discussion was the foundational right. They claimed that all other rights are founded on the right to life, because you have to be alive to have any other rights, like bodily autonomy, for example. Problem is, they're mixing up the actual life with the right. Being alive is indeed a requirement for all the other things, but we're not talking about being alive, we're talking about the right to life. That's a separate issue. And the right to life is not the foundational right. Because, for example, I could violate your bodily autonomy by enslaving you, or by taking your organs, or even doing something awful like raping you, and yet you would still live and still have the right to life. And you cannot have bodily autonomy if people are taking your organs or your blood unwillingly. Nor can you be killed without violating it, because that would be the ultimate violation of bodily autonomy, to be violated unto death. Now, a common thing that pops up is for them to overextend the metaphor about fetuses and the right to bodily autonomy, and then take it all the way to, does that mean you have the right to kill your offspring because that means anybody can kill those children. Well, no, because free living children, even if they're newborns or whatever, they have bodily autonomy, same as an adult does. We grant them that right, same as we grant them to adults. And killing them would obviously violate their bodily autonomy, and, in addition, would also be bad for society. It doesn't take an ethics professor to work out that if you live in a society where you can just be randomly killed at any time, or have your organs harvested, that's not gonna be a good society. And when it comes to abortion, the reverse is true. Any society that has free and easy access to abortions does well, does better. This is something you can look up online. And one last point they threw out for me was that the pilot and the co-pilot in the example from before have the right to move their bodies in any way they want, thanks to their bodily autonomy. But that means they can also do things like, yank controls and do stupid things to each other and passengers. Well, no. The pilot cannot do what they want at the expense of the passengers. As has been said, the right to swing your fist ends at my nose. Same thing here. The right for you to wave your arms around like a loony ends at the point where that starts to cause problems. You can imagine that might be a problem, not in a field, but in the cockpit of a passenger jet. One of the follow-ons from this is that by granting rights, we also grant responsibilities. That's one of the key signs of living in a society. Rights and responsibilities. And one of the responsibilities you have as a person is to not harm others. And forcing someone into a form of slavery is definitely a type of harm. Which means if we were to grant full rights to the fetus, we would also have to grant it the responsibility to do no harm to the woman, by not forcing her to carry to term if she doesn't want to. Or to put it another way, the fetus's right to swing its fist ends at her uterus. Now we're nearly done. There's another point I want to make. Anyone who's ever argued with a religious would have encountered the question, but what if you're wrong? Thing is, here, that's actually a useful question. If you've ever actually looked at a summary of points from an anti-choice webpage, for example, pretty much every single one of their points boils down to one point. Fetuses are human, killing humans is wrong, therefore killing fetuses is wrong, you should not have abortions. And as arguments go, that's not too bad. That's reasonably coherent and reasonably sane. But it's based on one foundational assumption, that the fetus is a human being. Not that it's human, that's not the part we're arguing, but it's a human being, or to put it another way, a person. Which is where the question comes in. But what if you're wrong? And that's the problem. Because if the anti-choicer were to actually accept that, sure, it's not a person, it might have human DNA, it might become a person in 9 months, but it's not what we'd call a person right now, then the whole thing just goes away. Because that's 99% of all arguments undercut right there. But what if I'm wrong? Well, probably sounds a bit arrogant, but it doesn't really matter. Like I said earlier, and I've said more than once, my stance is based on the fact that no full human being has the right to life at the expense of another person's bodily autonomy. Whether it be a violinist, or a fetus, or just a neighbour, it doesn't matter. That's not the point. It's not a special case just because one of the subjects, a small, undeveloped, potential human. And this is why pretty well every time, no matter what you argue or how, they're going to try and suck you down a rabbit hole of, but it's really a human being. Which it ain't. Because that's the whole crux of their argument, and they have no way of proving it. For the very simple reason that science really couldn't even tell you when a potential human becomes an actual human person. We don't know. Hell, we're not even really sure what makes an actual human person into a human person yet. We're getting there. Strides are being made in neuroscience, but wow, that's still tricky. And I think they know it. And unfortunately, when people know things like that, they start to get quite defensive, and that gets people dug in, gets their back up, and of course the whole situation is horribly emotive to start with. So just keep that in mind if you get involved in the debate yourself. So really no major change there, but some interesting points to think about. And certainly that was the best and most productive discussion I've ever had online about any topic, I think, and doubly so for the topic of abortion. It was really, really good. I haven't gone over their post. I've just sort of summarized what they told me, or at least my understanding of what they told me, and it was really good. I don't think we ended up agreeing, but it was certainly an excellent discussion. I can really see why Sam Harris likes to do these sorts of things, because by explaining it to another person, same kind of thing here, it really helped me get a grip for where my position stood and where the shape of it was, where the lines stood. So that's all for Dispatches from the Abortion Front Round 3. I doubt there'll be a Round 4 for any length of time. This one only really came about because of a really excellent series of questions and analogies, which I have summarized. Tune in next week for any one of a number of different episodes. I haven't actually decided which one it's going to be yet. It could be why it's wrong to murder or rape people, which is a discussion of morality. Are cows people, and is it okay to eat them, which is a discussion of ethical veganism, which should lead to some interesting anecdotes. How depression probably saved the human race. Yeah, really, that's a thing. Or possibly how actual rebuttals and refutations work, which is more epistemology stuff. I haven't decided which one it's going to be yet, but it's probably going to be one of those unless something really amazing jumps out at me. If you have a preference, put it in the comments below and I'll do that. Almost certainly. Bye for now.